right, so we're going to move on to, I guess, how people respond when they've had a traumatic incident or what our sort of trauma responses are. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our kind of survival and stress responses when we are faced with a threat or a perceived threat. And I'm sure you've all probably heard a little bit about fight, flight, freeze. And there's a newer area that the research is sort of looking at in terms of a fawn trauma response. And I'm just going to touch a little bit on each of those. And I guess this is just our body's natural reaction to danger and when there's some sort of threat or something that's going to threaten our safety and security. And these are sort of natural reactions that happen in our body, and they're very automatic. So we actually can't choose how we're going to respond to experiencing some sort of trauma or threat. So they happen very automatically in our body. And like I mentioned, we don't choose how we respond. So if you think about, a threat like, someone chasing you in the street, or, I don't know, you've got a growling dog coming up in front of you, your body's automatically going to respond around how you're going to manage that response. So we have the fight response, we have the flight response, the freeze, and the fawn. So fight is really when that, and I think last week you guys talked a little bit about the nervous system and particularly the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, but our fight and flight responses are these really active defense modes that we can sort of naturally kick into. So that fight defense mode, if there's a danger or threat that's in front of us, everything activates, all our stress hormones get released, our body gets ready to fight. There's more oxygen and blood pumping through the body. Our heart rate starts going faster. Our breathing rate increases to get that oxygen pumped through. And we get ready to sort of fight what's in front of us in order to protect ourselves from that danger. And so if you've got a growling dog in front of you, that might look like, literally kind of fighting and pushing and kicking and doing something to sort of move towards that threat. We can also have more of an active defensive flight. So really running and fleeing and getting out of there. If you've got a dog in front of you, you're going to get out of there as soon as you can, or, there's someone chasing you down the street, you're going to run. But the other really important trauma response that we often see is people freezing. So it's like this kind of immobilization tactic. And so children often move into a freeze mode when they're unable to fight, they're unable to run away. And in order to survive that threat or that danger, they literally freeze. So we might see this kind of dissociated state where they look a bit zoned out. It's sort of this numbing kind of response. And it's really that when I can't get out of there or fight back, I'm just going to kind of freeze in order to survive as well. And that's a really common sort of response that we see in sexual abuse as well with children. And the other sort of new area that we're now looking at in terms of the research of a trauma response is this fawn response. So, people kind of pleading and sort of people pleasing. And, if you had a growling dog, you might see someone being like, oh, please don't hurt me. What can I do? But obviously that's not a good example with a dog. You can't really plead with a dog. But this really kind of, when you can't run, you can't fight, you haven't frozen, but how can I sort of avoid this conflict or this danger? In order to sort of keep myself safe. So I was thinking about this, and we see children in classrooms that often get labelled with sort of behavioural problems, but sometimes it's actually a trauma response that they're having. So I can think of young people that I've worked with where they might have, pretty difficult home life where maybe mum or dad are very critical, give them a really hard time, put them down, yell, scream, criticize them, give them a hard time about, you're no good, you're a piece of crap, all these types of things. And, sometimes that might lead into more serious, being hit or things like that. And we might see a child in a classroom where a teacher comes over to them and starts giving them some feedback on their work, or corrects them, or gives them some sort of negative feedback or criticizes something about their work. And for a child, they're sort of always on edge, and for adults as well who've experienced trauma, always on kind of edge and what we call hypervigilance. So always looking around, when's the next threat, when's the next danger going to be present, and how am I going to protect myself so I can survive? And we might see a child in that situation in the classroom when the teacher comes over. And for them, that negative feedback straight away triggers, the trauma that they've experienced at home or with parents. And for them, this nervous system is going to be activated automatically and immediately. And they're going to go into one of these fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses. So we might have one child who, starts yelling at the teacher, flips a chair, flips the table, calls them, "You're a bitch, can't believe you just said that to me," moves towards them, gets really angry, and that fight response is automatically kicking in. We might have another child in that same response where their flight response gets kicked in, and they run, they leave the classroom, they can't handle that, and that's what they're going to do to protect themselves. They hide under a table and go into this kind of flight mode of, "I'm going to move and get away from this as quick as possible." We might, in that same situation, have a child who just shuts down, who starts to look really just, as if they're not listening, they're just disinterested, they're just phasing out, dissociating, and that's just, they're frozen in that moment, and that's how they're surviving and coping. But then we might also have a child who that fawn response gets kicked in, and it's like, yep, you're right, yep, what can I do? They're just trying to protect themselves once again, and how can I do that better? And yeah, you're right, it makes sense what you're saying, even if they disagree or have a different opinion, but go into this kind of people pleasing mode. So I think we have to be careful. Sometimes children get labeled as, the difficult child, or they've got behavioral problems, or, they're the unwell or strange child. But really, they, are automatically responding to threat and danger because of their past experiences. And they have no control over, how this kind of trauma response kicks in and how they choose to sort of protect and survive in that moment. So once again, just be mindful of the different responses to trauma that people have. And I know this looks like a really long list as well, but the responses that people have after trauma can be so varied. And most people are going to have a bit of an immediate response after they've had a traumatic incident, or they might also then have long-term responses after trauma. I would say that most people typically are able to sort of respond in helpful ways and be resilient and overcome that traumatic event. And most people are not going to experience long-term impacts of trauma because they've developed, I guess, helpful ways of coping. But then there will be a lot of people who might experience long-term impacts of trauma, and the responses are varied. So really, we can break it down into emotional reactions, physical reactions, cognitive reactions, so the way people think, behavioral reactions, or more like existential reactions, so making sense of the world and what's happened. But they're very varied. I won't go through them all, but it's really just to give you a sense of what could possibly happen. So we'll see a range of emotional reactions, from anger, sadness, guilt, shame, mood swings going up and down, physical reactions, so changes in their body, that kind of cognitive stuff of, can't get it out of their mind. We see memory problems because the brain starts to be impacted after trauma. Often see young kids blame themselves. "It was my fault. I didn't do anything. I didn't fight back." Behavioral reactions. So, those kids that get labeled naughty at school, who are, argumentative or not doing what they're told. Or kids just sort of withdrawing and adults withdrawing and just avoiding the world and life. And then there's kind of those existential that I mentioned around, why me? Why did that happen to me? Or not feeling like they have a sense of purpose in life. Or, more of a positive existential reaction might be, what, I'm going to try and redefine this and have some meaning, and, why did this happen? And can I get something out of this that's going to make, me stronger and redefine who I am in life and what it's all about. So a real varied kind of responses that we can see after people have experienced trauma. But I'm going to talk about it later, but healing and recovery is possible. So, no matter what someone's experienced, every individual has the potential to heal and recover after experiencing trauma. And most people do heal and recover without having these sort of long-term distressing impacts of that traumatic event. But I want to have a bit of a discussion in our groups again around the research shows that there's a range of factors that reduce the impact of trauma on individuals. Okay, so these are what we call protective factors. So things that are going to protect the individual and make it more likely that they're not going to have these long-term impacts after experiencing a traumatic event. So our protective factors that we know, so this is really linked to resiliency, linked to recovery, and less likelihood of developing, PTSD and those types of mental health problems. So we know that the protective factors are being resourceful and having good problem solving skills. So being able to find solutions of coping with problems. The other big one, connecting with others, such as family or friends. So rather than withdrawing and refusing to see people, connecting with other people. Another protective factor is coping with stress effectively and in a healthy manner. So rather than, using drugs or alcohol to cope with stress, but coping with it in an effective and healthy manner. So talking about it or, exercising, looking at your diet, things like that. Finding positive meaning in the trauma. Okay, that existential sort of area that we're touching on. So, is there some sort of meaning that I can take out of this? Pretty challenging to do though. Having social support available to you. We know the outcomes are so much better for people when they're socially connected. An interesting protective factor is helping others. So we know that when we actually, for example, volunteer or help other people, that also helps our own mental health and our mental states as well, and our ability to recover and heal when we, focus on how we can help other people. Holding the belief that there is something you can do to manage your feelings. So rather than, there's nothing I can do, my feelings are like the way they are and they're just going to be like this forever, but believing that, I've got some control and sense of how I manage my own feelings. Identifying as a survivor as opposed to a victim is linked with better outcomes for people. Seeking help goes without saying, seeking help, asking for help, using professionals and services and things like that. Self-disclosure of the trauma to loved ones. So that takes a lot of bravery about people who are able to say, hey, I want to let you know that something, has happened to me, and talking about it. And spirituality is the other protective factor that reduces impact on people. So whether it's religion or some other sense of meaning in the world, but having a strong sense of spirituality. So in our groups, what I want us to do is, as a group, decide which, one or two factors do you think are the most important in order to sort of protect people from these ongoing impacts of trauma? And why have we chosen those one or two factors as a group? So, we'll have a look at that list again, and let's think about, let's choose one or two. How is it going to help people the most once they've experienced some sort of traumatic event, and why do we think that's going to be the best sort of options in terms of protecting people?